Hey, this is my cross-cut sled that I built for kitchen cabinetry. In this video, I'm going to give you some explanations and steps as to how I made this sled. If you don't know what a cross-cut sled is, a cross-cut sled is a sort of a sled that slides over a table over a saw to make cross-cuts. And if you don't know what a cross-cut is, you have to understand the wood. The grain of the wood goes in a certain direction. If you look at any wood, if you're cutting parallel to the grain, it's called a rip cut, in which case you don't really need this sled. But if you're cutting perpendicular to the grain with the blade going perpendicular to the grain of the wood, that's a cross cut. Now there are two main reasons why one would need a crosscut sled. Number one is because it's safer. It's much safer to use a crosscut sled than trying to use the tabletop or the saw directly, because you get kickbacks. If you don't know what a kickback is a piece of wood flying towards you on a table saw. That's basically what it is, and it's very dangerous. Crosscut sled basically minimizes kickbacks substantially. The other reason why you would need this sled is to make exactly square cuts. In other words, exactly perpendicular cuts. In which case, in my case, since I'm building cabinetry, in cabinets, all the sides should be exactly square to each other. And that's why I built this crosscut sled. Now what I started with is a good quality 3/4 inch plywood. The length of the plywood was about 60 inches from this edge all the way to the end. And the width of the plywood is about 28 inches from this edge all the way to the end. For the purpose of the video, I'm calling this the front fence. The front fence is the one where I am standing and pushing my sled in order to do the cut. And it's about 1.5 inches, and the back fence is the same, about 1.5 inches. So if I subtract 28 minus 1.5 minus 1.5, I get about 24.5 inches of working width to make crosscuts with 24.5 inches, up to 24.5 inches. Next step would be to install the Mitre sliders. The Mitre sliders are basically metal strips that you can find in Rockler. I'll put a link, which basically slide in the slot of the table saw and the extent. Sequence of steps I followed was to adjust the table saw fence to about 11 inches from the blade to the fence surface, and this gives you a good parallel surface to work with when you put the plywood on top of the Mitre sliders. Once I adjusted the fence, you can see here the table saw slots. I put some pennies in this slot, and then I put the Mitre sliders on top of the pennies, and then I put some glue on top of the metal sliders, and I put the plywood on top of the glue. So within 10 minutes I had a plywood that was exactly parallel to the blade using this fence, and I sat it on top of the glue to make it stick temporarily until I screw it in. Once I had the plywood stuck with super glue on the slider, you can see the screws here that I screwed in. Now I had both the sliders screwed in. One thing to remember is I have a 24-inch metal sliders, and the metal sliders have to be aligned to the back fence. You can see the metal sliders here aligned with the back fence. So the 24 inches start from here and it reaches about somewhere 24 inches down the line. Once the plywood and the metal sliders are ready, the next step is to basically build the fence. This is the front fence, like I said, and this is the back fence. The fences are about 4 inches in height, both the front fence as well as the back fence. Now the main thing to remember is the back fence doesn't have to be perpendicular or square. The back fence is just a fence to make sure the wood doesn't slide out. It doesn't have to be accurate, but the front fence has to be exactly perpendicular to the saw line, to the saw. The front fence also needs to be parallel. That means it has to be 4 inches all the way from across the length of the wood. In order to do that, I followed a process called ABA. ABA is basically cutting the wood 3 times on the edge to make it parallel. If I want a 4-inch, I set the saw to about 4 1/4 and make a pass. That's called the A side. Then I turn the wood, adjust the blade to about 4 instead of 4 1/4, it's going to be 4 1/8, and pass the wood again, which is the B side. And then I come back and flip the wood again at 4 inches, and that will be my final pass, and that will be the A side again. So we started with A, went over to the other side to B, and came back to A. We cut it 3 times, and now we have a fully parallel 4-inch wood. 4.5, that's 4 1/4 was the first pass, 4 1/8 was the second pass, and 4-inch, which is my desired width, was the last part. And one aspect to make sure it's perpendicular is to use a fence that is extremely straight. I found out that I couldn't use plywood because it bends quite a bit, but I used 2 1x5s and glued them together and then cut 4 inches in height. The back fence, you can use anything you have. It could be scrap wood. You can see here it's a 2 plywood, 3/4 inch plywood, leftover plywood that I glued together and just screwed it on from the bottom of the plywood. The other thing I did at the back fence is to cut off certain portions on this side and on the rest of the side. This helps to reduce the weight. You don't need a whole 4-inch. All you need is about 3/4. Mostly you would need 3/4 in height, or maybe up to 1 inch in height. So you can cut off the rest to reduce the weight. Once I had the front fence ready, I could not screw it in first. I had to prepare this for tracks, and these tracks are the blue metal bars that you see. It's basically to hold the clamps and hold the measuring tape. So I had to use a router to put this top track in first. So you'd route this behind the fence to make sure the top track fits, and ever so slightly, maybe about 2/16 of an inch gap left here. And the top track is used to get this stop lock, and the stop lock slides on top of this top track. The other place I had to route is to basically use this 2 feet long universal T-track. It's basically 2 of them, one on this end and one on the other end, as you see, and it holds 2 clamps. This one holds 1 clamp. The clamp is removable, by the way, and on the other side is another T-track that holds the other clamp. So I have 2 feet on this side and 2 feet on the other side of clamp. The clamp also slides back and forth to hold the wood in place. The top track, by the way, is 4 feet long, and it starts roughly a little bit, possibly about half an inch or 3/4 inch on the left side of the saw cut line, right here. You might be wondering why this 0th mark doesn't start at the same parallel line as the saw cut line. But don't worry about that, because this system is built in such a way that it doesn't matter where the 0 starts. We're going to adjust the length using the stop saw, the marking over here, to make sure we get the right width later on. Once the front fence was ready, I went ahead and put in the tracks to make sure it fit properly, screwed it in, the universal T-tracks on both ends, and also the top track on the top, and I screwed it in. I had to use a tap screw to make the holes, and I basically just used a few screws to just screw it. I also routed off the bottom of the front fence a little bit to create sort of a space using a circular router bit. This basically lets you collect dust. So when I put the wood paste against the fence, it's not messed up. It's exactly touching the fence and not pushed forward because of any dust accumulated. And any dust which will be accumulated will go inside, and you'll have to periodically vacuum it out. Now my front fence is ready to put in. So what I did is I started with just 1 screw. I put the fence on top, and I put this 1 screw in this corner, which I call the pivot screw. And on the other side, I just put a clamp like this and just flush with the surface of the plywood as perpendicular. I think I just clamped it in. We're going to adjust it later. Then I took the fence and I started making the first cut that you see on this plywood over here. I started from this end and I pushed the fence in straight onto this slide until the blade reaches somewhere in the middle, like this, and I stopped there and I turned off the machine. Then I used something called a square, a bigger square like this, to just level the square, make the square touch the blade, and then I roughly adjusted the fence. Again, I took the clamp out and I made sure my fence is touching the square like this, so I know that I can make the fence as perpendicular to the blade using the square. And then once I was satisfied, I put in the second screw right here. So I have now two screws using the square method. I have one screw over here and one screw all the way, the first pivot screw that I showed you before. Once I was done with that, I went back and finished the cut that I started, the one that I stopped in between. I pushed the sled all the way out and had the blade come out like this on this side. Now I have a full cut from the front to the end. Now the next step is the most critical step, is to make sure that this front fence is exactly perpendicular to the saw line. Like I said before, I used this square in order to just roughly make sure that this is perpendicular, and I put in two screws, the pivot screw over here under this fence and under the this side of the fence near the blade, and another screw in on this side. But in order to make it exactly perpendicular, we have to follow something called the 5-cut method. And I'm not going to go into details of that in this video. I will post a couple of my favorite links that I found that explains the 5-cut method very well, and I'll post that in the description. But the 5-cut method is what will make or break this slider, this perpendicular, to make a cross cut. So that method has to be followed, and you need certain tools for that, which is also explained in the video. I will post it in the description. Once I followed the 5-cut method and made sure that this front fence is exactly up to 1/1000th of an inch, within an error margin of 1/1000th of an inch, is perpendicular to the saw cutting line over here. Then I went ahead and screwed the rest of the screws that you see in the bottom, every 6 to 8 inches or so apart. And the last thing I did was to punch some holes, and these holes are in a certain pattern. They're using this hole saw drill bit that you see over here. And you can see from this angle there's about 3 or 4 lines. One line, the second line has 2 holes, the third line has 3 holes again, the fourth line has 2 holes, and the fifth line has again 3 holes over here. And these holes serve a purpose. If I am dealing with this big piece of plywood usually has a natural bend to it. If you take any plywood and look down the line, it will hardly ever be straight. So these holes are used to break the tension in the plywood, so the plywood remains flat basically all the way and doesn't bend. The other advantage is basically you reduce the weight, so it's lighter. The third advantage is you can basically hold on to these holes and lift it, it's easier. And the fourth advantage is you can use these holes basically, especially this end of these holes, to basically hang it somewhere, so you don't have to, you can hang it on the wall using these holes. Then I put this top block in. Basically I took a piece of oak plywood that I have and I put in 4-inch, drilled a hole, and just basically took some washer and 4-inch screws and punched it in over here and tied it up with a nut. Now I have basically a stop lock, and if you want to know how to adjust this scale to make sure it's correct, you basically again have to look at the video description, one of the video description that I'll put in the description. It explains pretty well how to adjust this here.